Well, good day to everyone. Welcome to SSI Spotlight, Mental Health Best Practices webinar series. My name is Brian Hainline, and I'm the NCAA Chief Medical Officer. And this is our second in a series of webinars, today focusing on mental health provider types, referral pathways, and telehealth. I'm really pleased that we're with two guests, Randy Barker, who is the Director of University of Wisconsin-Superior Pruitt Center for Mindfulness and Wellbeing from Division III, and Sarah Dow, Director of Student-Athlete Wellness and Clinical Counselor at Michigan Technological University, Division II. First, let me just provide an overview of the purpose of these webinars. So the primary purpose is to review and refresh with the membership our NCAA mental health best practices. These were first published in 2016, widely distributed to the membership. And importantly, these best practices were endorsed by 25 of the leading medical, sports medicine, mental health, and scientific organizations in the country. And these best practices became association-wide legislation in that all member schools must have in place mental health programs consistent with the mental health best practices. So why are we doing this webinar series now? Well, it's to provide examples to the membership of best practices from member schools for how they have operationalized the NCAA mental health best practices. And this is really in preparation for another update to the NCAA mental health best practices, which will be rolled out in January 2024. The last update was in 2020. So this update is upon the recommendation of the Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports. We will be focusing on issues such as cultural sensitivity and some new emerging topics, such as NIL and its impact on mental health, corruption or gambling in sport, social media, and issues such as suicide contagion. And we're also going to be addressing some recent survey data from the membership, which indicated that there wasn't necessarily a great comfort level for student athletes and how they can help support one another for mental health and mental well-being, or uncertainty regarding referral patterns, both from the student athlete's point of view and other athletics personnel point of view, and some concern about not prioritizing a culture of wellness and mental health care seeking. So that's a little background on our webinar series, and let's now turn to our guests. So Sarah and Randy, really thanks so much for being here. And maybe if you could start out, we'll begin with you, Sarah, and then you, Randy. Just tell us a little bit about yourselves, your school, and your specific roles day to day.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here. So my main role at my campus, I serve as the Director of Student-Athlete Wellness and Clinical Counselor. And in that role, I'm responsible for providing the mental health services for our athletes, both at individual and group levels, and working with our staff to ensure that we have proper education and programming related to the health and safety and well-being of our student athletes. In addition to my primary duties, I also serve as the Senior Woman Administrator for our department. So there's an administrative role that I also take responsibility for here on our campus.
Well, thanks, Sarah. And Randy?
Yeah, first and foremost, thank you for having me here today. And my name's Randy Barker. I'm the Director of Health Counseling and Wellbeing at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. And within that role, I have the honor of overseeing our student health and counseling services, those reactive responsive services. So providing mental health counseling to our students, our student athletes, along with psychiatric referrals. And then also oversee the Pruitt Center for Mindfulness and Wellbeing, which is a real unique center. It's providing those proactive preventative services, which we feel as important. So really teaching the science and practice of mindfulness and well-being to our students. I think at times when we look at mental health, we try to teach people how to swim when they're drowning, and we don't feel that that's always the best solution. So really being proactive. So we do a lot of work with athletics, doing a lot of work with the coaches in each team surrounding those two areas.
Well, thanks. And again, really appreciate you both being here and, representing D2 and D3. When we first rolled out our mental health best practices, there were concerns that, well, this is just for high resource institutions at the D1 level. And we were very clear that our recommendations that came from the consensus group are resource independent. They're for all member schools. We're going to first start talking about screening. And before I ask this first question, we have screening in different domains. For example, there's screening for heart disease and preventing cardiac death. There's screening for the potential for biomechanical injuries, and we want to, mitigate against that. And so now there are new and emerging tools for screening for mental health symptoms and disorders. So first of all, let's start with you, Sarah. How do you socialize among student athletes, the coaches, the athletics healthcare providers, and others that there indeed is screening for mental health, and how you are going to go about doing that?
Sure. Yeah. And I think this is one of the harder things, right? Because it's something that constantly needs to happen. There's a constant staff turnover. We've constantly got new athletes coming in every fall. And so I think we really lean on education as that initial step. And that oftentimes happens at our season startup meetings, really talking about what our athletes can expect, what our coaches can look for in relation to the screenings, giving them an understanding as to really why we're doing this, what it looks like, and how we're going to use what we find during those screenings. And I think the education piece also really allows an opportunity to talk about confidentiality during the screening process and really ensure that we are trying to break down the stigma that if you're coming for mental health, that there's a concern there, and just letting people know that mental health can also provide a checkpoint, and it can provide an opportunity to do some self-reflection, get in contact with some resources that maybe could benefit you in any area of your well-being, and hopefully seek to find a way to engage and interact with our athletes prior to something becoming an emergency or a crisis situation. And so really leaning on the education piece to touch on a lot of those aspects, and really just engaging, asking questions, allowing for our athletes and our coaches to really just get their hands wet with something that feels a little bit more comfortable a lot of the times versus setting up an individual meeting right away.
And Manny, let me ask this question in a slightly different way. When we roll out our mental health best practices, one of the things we've said is we want mental health care seeking to be as normalized as seeking care if you've sprained your ankle. And so I'm just wondering, within that context for screening, I don't think coaches would have a concern, or others, for cardiac screening or for screening to prevent a musculoskeletal injury. But how do you set it up in such a way that screening for mental health disorders is as normal as screening for cardiac disease or screening for a musculoskeletal injury?
Yeah, I think exactly what Sarah mentioned was education and building that trust and confidence with the staff. We've been doing screening for the last 3 years, and I really think you need a commitment and buy-in from everyone involved, especially from the top down. We're very fortunate at our university that our athletic director is very supportive. Our training staff is supportive, and our coaches have really bought into that. And that's the trickle down effect. When student athletes see that, they start to realize that, yeah, this is important. They value our mental health and well-being. And it's just, something that they expect that's going to take place. And I think it's vital and important that we continue to do that. Our student athletes deserve mental health and well-being services. And like Sarah said, I think it's really proactive, having that touch point and making sure that if there are areas of concern, that we're providing them with those resources and tools and services sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and you touched on a really important theme that we're going to be talking about throughout these webinar series. And, you mentioned the top down, you're really speaking about a culture. So how do you set the culture that all of the screening and setting the expectations for mental health, that it's just what should be happening as much as any other aspect of healthcare for student athletes? So So focus still on that, Randy. Maybe can you talk to the audience about some of the screening tools that you've used, and has that evolved over the 3 years that you've been doing this?
Yeah, I mean, we use and we have a membership with the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, which is the CCMH from Penn State. And with that membership, we have access and permission to use an assessment called the CCAPS, which is a 36-item screening tool. It has 8 different subsections, and I think it's very easy, simple, doesn't take a lot of time. It's easy to also interpret and score. And I think it does a really good job of identifying these areas, common areas that student athletes may struggle in. It looks at depression, general anxiety, social anxiety, academic distress, eating concerns, frustration, family distress, and alcohol use. So I think it does a very, very good job of looking at those areas. And I think it really comes back to just normalizing that mental health is no different than physical health. We cannot stress that enough. And we also look, one of the things that we always stress with athletics is by looking after your mental health, it's really going to be looking at improving performance in all areas of their lives.
Right. And you mentioned the Center for Collegiate Mental Health at Penn State. I believe there's more than a couple hundred schools that are part of that, right?
Yeah, no, I know that there's hundreds of schools that are part of that and are utilizing that assessment screening tool.
Yeah, another thing for our membership. I mean, and that's really becomes a centralized database, very, very important. So thanks for sharing that. Sarah, what about you? How have your tools evolved, and any specifics you want to share about that?
Absolutely. So as Randy talked about, the CCAPS through CCMH is really what we rely on for our primary screening measure. It's been a really great tool that's allowed us to do in-person screenings, which is something that we were really, really trying to be proactive about due to the nature of some of the questions that are asked. So that's been wonderful for us. We also this year will start to screen for eating disorders in athletes in conjunction with our sports medicine staff and our team physicians. So that's something new this year that we're rolling out. And so I'm sure we'll have a lot of tweaks and adjustments that we'll likely make there. But we just know that the CCAPS doesn't always capture the entirety of what eating disorders or disordered eating patterns can look like in our athlete populations. And so we wanted to introduce a secondary measure that would just give us a little bit more information as we're meeting with our multidisciplinary teams to figure out where we might want to support our teams or what athletes might benefit from additional support within that area specifically. And as a secondary measure, so any athletes who test elevated for the CCAPS are typically referred for an individual assessment with myself or another clinician on our campus. And we'll often rely on the SHMAT for that, which is developed by the IOC. And what I love about that tool is it's very athlete specific. It's a bit longer. It's a little bit more thorough. It takes a little bit more time to score and administer, which is why we don't use it for our baseline screening. But it does a great job of collecting more information and allowing us to have a more in-depth conversation with our athlete once they're in front of us versus the CCAPS, which is just such a great touch point measure.
So a few acronyms there, and maybe to spell those out first. So the SMAT that you mentioned, or in Europe it's called the SMOT, but it's the Sports Mental Health Assessment Tool. So that was, for our audience, developed by the International Olympic Committee, and it was touted as really being the first sport-specific screening tool, and it has been validated, and I suspect that's going to be rolled out more. But one of the main themes here is there's not just one universal screening. It's what makes sense for your school. So, Sarah, walk us through a little bit how you set it up, because one of the concerns is, well, how do we organize this on our campus? And is this going to take days and days to do? And then the coaches are going to say, well, you're taking my athletes away from practice time. How do you just operationalize screening and when you're setting everything up?
Sure. And I think that is such an important consideration because especially at the D2 and D3 levels, right? And even Division I schools, you may not have an entire staff of clinicians that's there to do this type of work. So what we've found to be really beneficial on our campus is partnering with our counseling center down campus to make sure that we're working as a team to administer these screenings and give our athletes that touch point and support at the start of the year. And it still takes time, but we're fortunate to have that buy-in from our partners across campus. We're fortunate that our coaches and our upper administration really supports this process as well. And so it's an all hands on deck kind of effort every year, but we know that we have that buy-in after doing this for a handful of years, and that has made a big difference. So typically what we'll do is we'll set aside an hour or longer for larger rosters, and really have our athletes come in smaller windows so that there's not 60 athletes waiting and just waiting for an iPad to take their turn. And essentially they'll begin the screening, and once they are done with the answering portion of the screening tool, they'll go back with the clinician, meet for a handful of minutes or whatever might be necessary for that touch point to debrief the results and ensure that the athlete is getting a personalized experience. And if an athlete needs further assessment or a further touch point, they're referred to myself or another campus counselor, if that's their preference, to really continue with the screening process and really see what other resources or support networks we might want to engage that athlete with in order to help them really get that experience that they need to be the most healthy, successful, happy human that they can while they're on our campus.
And that's great. And again, you sort of emphasize a point that Randy had made. You set the expectations, you manage the expectations, and it's about the cultural issue. This is really important. Randy, I know with screening tools, we sometimes talk about, well, you just don't screen once every 4 years or even once a year. And you have sort of a schedule, and are there maybe some things that you would say, well, maybe this particular athlete we should screen again because she just lost a close relative or, just had an academic hardship or this or that. So how do you set the sort of timing of the screening and maybe doing more than one a year?
Yeah, well, we do it prior to their season starting. And what we do is we set 15 minutes aside, and each student athlete is, what we do is we want them to meet with someone within our staff. We're a smaller school, we're staffed appropriate. So we schedule 15 minutes, and we feel that that's really important for a variety of reasons. First is the ability to go through, but not only that, but every student athlete that comes to our office then knows where we're located. Right. And that's a lot of the difficulty. Number one is where you're located and walking through the door. Second of all, when we go through the assessment, again, we're able to provide those services if need be. We're able to connect with them so they feel that connection. So even though they may not be struggling at that moment in time, I think it really sets the stage for them coming back if they are struggling. So I think it's, for us, we have that advantage of really making that touch point early for them to be aware of where we're at and making that connection. And then I think it's really follow up. What we really do is having those relationships with the coaching staff and making sure that we're checking in with them throughout the year of, how are things going? Are there students that, are on your radar? Are there things that we can be doing to reach out? We really make a conscious, deliberate effort to get in and do a lot of trainings and workshops. So those student athletes are seeing us on a consistent basis. We're trying to make sure that we're continuing the dialogue around mental health and well-being. It's just not a one thing, check the box and move on. So that's one of the things that we try to do is really continuing the conversation and constant and continuous check-ins.
Yeah, I think you really bring up an important point, Randy. It's because you can't have your eyes on every student athlete, but you're really setting up like a buddy system or a bystander intervention system, or this is a team effort. And if you see someone who's kind of falling off the chart a little bit or isn't behaving the same, that they know they can reach out to you all directly, and that's possible an intervention you can make, or you're screening them again. So really critical information there. So what happens? You're doing the screening, and I've received this question from many people, and they say, well, what if we screen and we find out that someone is suicidal? Well, just like if you're screening for cardiac and someone has a worrisome cardiac arrhythmia, you need to be able to intervene right away. So Sarah and Randy, how do you set up for that there may be an outcome in which you really need an emergency intervention based on the screening?
Absolutely. So I think for us, that's why we really emphasize the in-person portion of the screenings. We just really thought that if we're going to be asking questions related to suicide, self-harm, or really anything that has to do with a potential threat to that individual or somebody else, that we need to have the opportunity to debrief that result in real time with that individual and do further safety assessments to really figure out what resources, what emergency measures, if any, we might need to tap into to ensure that individual is safe. And we also make sure to really address that with our team that is working there, since we are collaborating with some down campus partners. And so everybody's on board that if we do get a yes to a safety measure on the assessment, that's a little bit more of an in-depth conversation with that student athlete. We'll take the time that's needed. We're not going to rush the screening just to get it done. And the other staff members who are working with us to fill that hour and get the rest of the athletes through will kind of just continue to go business as usual, unless there's a concern that requires another clinician to get pulled into that consultation.
So it seems like both of you have a system in which at the front end, everyone is aware of who is providing the mental health resources. And so you've sort of set that expectation, or you've managed it, and people aren't wondering where to go. How do you separate that? So that's for screening, more routine mental health care, and if there's a mental health emergency. And so say someone is acutely psychotic or paranoid or suicidal or homicidal. How do you manage that expectation at the front end too, so that everyone knows where to go in case of an emergency?
Yeah, I mean, part of that, again, comes back to education, of really making sure that we're educating as many people as possible, especially in athletics, about how to recognize, respond, make those appropriate referrals. And, again, we do all our screenings in person. And if we feel like someone is, at the severity level where they're at risk of harming themselves or others, or unable to function on their own, then we're going to take the time and make sure that we're doing a full assessment to really, to assess for all those risks, and then take the appropriate action for whatever that may be. It may be creating a safety plan. It may be requiring, hospitalization. But our job is to always make sure that we're doing a full assessment and we're taking the appropriate action in the best interest and safety of our student athletes.
Yeah, we, in our first webinar series, we actually talked about the mental health emergency action plan, and the way we have tried to educate the membership about it. It's no different than having an action plan if someone goes into cardiac arrest, and within 3 minutes you're giving CPR and automatic external defibrillation. And so having that, you're really letting everyone know that this is what happens in an emergency. Let me shift gears a little bit. Do either of you have experience using telehealth as a way of working with your student athletes? So, for many member schools, they only have so many licensed mental health providers, but during the COVID pandemic, especially, telehealth became really widely used. And as clinicians, we understood that it has a real value. So Sarah, I'll start with you, and then Randy, have you been utilizing telehealth, and how has it been working?
Absolutely. We rely pretty heavily on telehealth services as a predominantly rural institution. So it's something that's really key for us to be able to provide our athletes with a diverse range of options for providers, services, specialty areas of care, when we know that our immediate community campus cannot support some of those needs. So specifically for psychiatric services, for more intensive treatment options, for specific providers or types of care that somebody might be looking for to meet needs such as trauma, right, or grief counseling that might be a little bit more niche and individualized to that individual. That's something that we really lean on telehealth for. We also have our school, our campus in its entirety contracts with a telehealth service, which allows for our community to access a 24/7 crisis line or to receive ongoing therapy through this platform as well. But that has been something that's really added on to the services that we can provide in athletics, is having this larger campus resource that anybody can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, get connected with a master's level clinician, and really can debrief what they need. And if this is an emergency or if it's a non-emergency, and really enact a pathway depending on what the assessment reveals.
Yeah, you touch on a really important point, Sarah. For trauma-informed mental health services, or someone has undergone a trauma, or maybe for the first time is unearthing that trauma and coming to realize what that means, that does really require more intense therapy, and telehealth can really provide that sort of service for someone who needs that in-depth therapy. So that's a really great point. Randy, how about telehealth services where you are?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with COVID, we had to kind of adjust quicker than perhaps we were all ready for, and found it to be effective. It's been able to broaden our services and offer more robust services. And very similar to Sarah, we also have a contract through, actually the UW system has a contract with a company that provides telemental health counseling along with telepsychiatry. And that's, it's been very helpful for our student athletes, because at times their schedules are very busy, and it may not, coincide with our schedule of Monday to Friday, that 8 to 4:30. So it really allows them more options to seek those services, perhaps in the evening, on the weekends. It also allows them to, like Sarah mentioned, is to really see perhaps, or seek out a more diverse or specialized clinician for whatever it is that they're going through or wanting or needing. So I think it's really, broadened and expanded the options for our student athletes to access those services.
Yeah, Randy, I really like that point. And I think especially just being mindful as clinicians, though, as well, of, sometimes mental health via teleservice is not the most appropriate modality. And so thinking back to the screening tools that we're using, right, that process is so important for being a touch point and helping our athletes really understand, well, what is the best resource for you? And is this something that you can get on our campus, in our community, or are we wanting to maybe work with some outside services to make sure that you're really getting what you need to be successful and healthy here? And so that touch point in screenings, or the follow-up debrief, is so important for building that rapport, gaining that trust, allowing to really dissect, well, what kind of care do you need, and what's going to be the best for your presenting concerns, in a way that, otherwise we might not have the ability to help direct that search for additional resources.
Yeah, it's really helpful. What about, have you encountered barriers to, the student athletes or coaches really being open to seeking out mental health care, or really even creating an environment that promotes wellness? Maybe if Randy and Sarah, if you can share if you've been encountering barriers, and then how you've approached them.
Well, I mean, I think the barriers are still the stigma surrounding mental health. I mean, we've come a long ways. We've done a lot of outstanding work there, but it still exists. And I think that, we need to continue our work surrounding that. I think it's, again, about talking about what mental health counseling is. I think there's still a lot of misconceptions of what it's about. And I think, it's building that trust and confidence that we're here to support our coaches, support our student athletes, to really help them be as successful as possible. And our job is to try to get them back playing as quickly as possible, but also taking the steps that are required for them to be in a place that they feel safe and able to compete at the level that they're capable of. I think the other thing is that confidentiality. I think students are always a little scared about, well, is this going to get back to teammates? Is this going to get back to my coach? So really reinforcing the confidentiality of the services that we provide.
Yeah, great point. Sarah?
Yeah, Randy, I think the confidentiality and stigma aspects are things that are always going to be there. They're always going to be present and continuously need to be talked about within our sport settings. And I think additionally, we have athletes who come from so many different backgrounds and so many different cultures, right? And so just really having those conversations with staff even, and other sports medicine providers, your support staff in all areas, in terms of, hey, this doesn't always look the same for everybody. And so just because this is your experience, just because this is what the team has experienced before, doesn't mean it's always going to look the same when individuals are struggling or when they're having trouble accessing care. So I think part of our role can be really sitting back, reflecting, are there new barriers? Are there things we haven't looked at or need to look at in a new way to ensure that we're continuously seeking out things that could be inhibiting people from accessing our services?
Yeah, I can't reinforce the diversity of staff. And I think the other barrier too is student athletes at times, they want to be seen by someone that has that athletic background and that athletic knowledge about what it is and the culture that goes along with that. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the cultural sensitivity issue was actually one of the main drivers for updating our mental health best practices. Well, let me move to a last question. And we've talked about coaches a lot. There's unequivocal data that coaches are the single most important influence on athletes. And so what the coaches say, that often sets the culture. So how have you all been working with the coaches to really shift the culture so that it really is one of, setting an environment of mental health wellness and encouraging mental health care seeking when appropriate? How do you work through that?
That's a great question. We lean really heavily on mental health first aid training for our coaches and our support staff, just to give them a really solid foundation from which to work when they are working with their athletes. But I think there's even day-to-day things that we can do. And as an in-house provider, I share a hallway with a lot of our coaches. I'm right down the hall, can be easily reached. And so I think just modeling some of those behaviors, right? Checking in with my coaches and how are you doing today? How was your weekend? Hey, I haven't seen you around in a while. What's been going on with you? And really engaging in that conversation, rather than it just being hey, how's it going in the hallway? Because I think that models for them maybe hey, this person checked in with me. They spent some time, they listened, and models maybe what those conversations can look like with their athletes. And those small things can just go such a long way when we're talking about building the relationships, establishing trust, and helping our coaches to feel confident that we are there to help their programs, their athletes, and really just support what they're looking to do with their programs.
And I loved how you mentioned the mental health first aid, Sarah. That was our first webinar series. We talked about a school that mandated that for every single one of their coaches. So pretty cool thing. So Randy, how do you work with the coaches?
Yeah, very similar, as Sarah mentioned, is really about building that trust and consistency and building those relationships with them, that they know that we're there for them. We're there to support their student athletes. We're there in the best interest of the student athletes to really help them in and out of the classroom. I think what also Sarah mentioned is they model, right, is really making sure that they're looking after their mental health and well-being, and that they're having continual discussion around this topic. Again, it's not something that, is just talked about once. We encourage this to be a continual narrative throughout their school year and their time there. Again, it's education. Anytime that we have an opportunity to present, for an athletic team, we're there. We get very excited about that. So those are some of the steps that we take. We've really worked hard to get, the athletic department on board, and we see it's made a significant difference. We've continued to see an increase in student athletes utilizing our services.
Well, it must be incredibly gratifying too, because you know this is what's best for everyone, and we're really in the business of human development and promoting mental and physical health and safety and performance, and the mental health is integral to all of that. Look, Sarah and Randy, this has really been so invaluable. I know the membership appreciates this, and I really want to just thank you for taking the time, but more importantly for the leadership you've demonstrated, not only at your school level, but really nationwide. It means a great deal to all of us, and especially to why we're all here, to our student athletes. So thanks for taking the time, and looking forward to staying connected.
Thank you so much.
And now we'll be taking questions from the audience, and so you can just type your questions in, and then we'll be reviewing them and do our best to answer them. So thanks, everyone. Looking forward to the next part.